Today we're going to sew this hoodie, complete with big pockets which are cover stitched, with the top and bottom cover. Everything is constructed on the overlocker, including all the ribbing and cuffing. We are also going to hem our unlined hood using the Coverstitch. If you want to see more sewing videos, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I am using industrial machines, but you can do all the steps on your domestic ones. You can use a reverse cover stitch if you have a cover stitch machine, or decorative stitches or a zigzag on your domestic sewing machine. If you don't have an overlocker, the construction can be done using a stretch stitch on your domestic sewing machine. I am using a modified border pattern in this video, but the pockets can be done in any sweatshirt or hoodie in the same way. We're going to prepare the front of the hoodie first. I'm measuring the pocket openings, leaving enough space from the bottom to make the pockets deep enough, and cutting out the curve of the opening to be big enough to fit my hand. You can make the curve deeper for a bigger opening. The lining will then show slightly more. You can use a French curve, a pattern maker, or just freehand it. My quite flat and quite small opening starts 12 centimeters from the bottom, and the opening itself is 11 centimeters. It does stretch, but if you have bigger hands, make the opening longer or deeper. I cut out both openings at the same time, having the bodice front unfold. For my pocket pouches, I'm going to use Waffle Juki pattern template, link in the description. But you can draft your own pocket pouches using a pattern maker or a French curve, or you can use a pocket from another pattern. It's important that the pocket pouch extends beyond the opening by at least the seam allowance width. I like to have at least 1.5 centimeters beyond and above the opening. I'm cutting out my pocket pouches in cotton jersey. I'm cutting them out on fold, so I will definitely have a pair or a mirror image. Of course, you can change the shape of your pocket pouches to suit your needs. Don't make them too complicated if you are using a cover stitch, because they will be difficult to top stitch. So not too many curves or angles. The only thing to remember here is that you need a pair and that they have to be at least the seam allowance longer than the openings. I like using a rotary cutter, but if you prefer scissors, do it your way. Easy peasy, and we have a pair of elephant's ears or pockets. We can now cut our ribbing to finish the pocket openings. You don't need to finish them with ribbing. You can simply use strips of jersey. My ribbing is tubular, so I'll cut it open first, and then I'm going to cut horizontal strips 5 centimeters or 2 inches wide. The finished trim will be 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch wide. This is a relatively lightweight ribbing from Beyond the Pink Door, link in the description, which is perfect for my pocket openings. Don't use heavyweight ribbing as it might cause the pocket to gape. I'm going to cut an extra strip, though one is enough for the pockets. Our ribbing trims are going to be sewn right sides together to the openings of the pockets. Check which one is the right side of the ribbing. It helps if you actually knit, as in use knitting needles to make scarves and socks, because the wrong side of ribbing looks like purl stitches, the right side looks like knit stitches. The ribbing is folded lengthwise with its wrong sides together, so we'll have the right side of the ribbing and the right side of the sweatshirt matching. I can now finish the openings using my ribbing strips. I don't pre-cut my strips, I cut them as I sew. I'm using my overlocker, but it can also be done on a regular sewing machine. I'm not stretching the ribbing as I sew. My openings are small enough as they are. The raw edges of the opening and the raw edges of my folded ribbing are together. The fabric I use for the sweatshirt is 100% polyester alpine fleece or meshback fleece. It's properly heavyweight, around 360 grams per meter. One opening done, we can now finish the other one. Remember, we are going to top stitch it using a cover stitch. If you are worried that your domestic cover stitch will struggle to top stitch over a bulky seam, you can attach the ribbing using a regular machine, Or you can flatten the seam with a hammer, or simply with your iron. Press the seam towards the bodice. The seam needs to be pressed or finger pressed towards the bodice to be top stitched. Our trims are attached. We can now move to the cover stitch. If you attached your ribbing with a regular sewing machine, don't trim or grade your seams. All the needles in the cover stitch should ideally penetrate the same thickness of fabric. If you trim and grade your seams, you'll need compensation. It would be pointless. Anyway, the front of the hoodie is ready for cover stitching, so let's go. I'm going to use top and bottom cover, so the ladder stitch is going to be created on the right and the wrong side of the fabric. This machine has an upper looper, which in a cover stitch is called a spreader, and its movements are visible as you cover stitch. I need to thread my spreader first, as I don't use it for hemming. And yes, threading industrial machines can be a bit fiddly, so I use tweezers. Unfortunately, I don't have a heart surgeon's stable hands. Okay, so I'm top stitching close to the edge, but all my needles strike just under the seam joining the ribbing and the fleece. You can cover stitch with the center needle in the ditch, in other words, in the seam, the left outer needle in the fabric and the right outer needle in the ribbing. It creates a different look, so you can try if you like it. I'm using grey on grey, so you might not see it, but it is a top and bottom cover. The seam is flat, so it's brilliant anyway. We can do the same to the other pocket opening. Remember that your seam is pressed towards the bodice. Make sure you don't twist anything as you cover stitch. Don't pull the fabric, just hold it firmly and guide it under the foot. The machine will do the job, you can just relax. Go slowly as you are sewing a curve. I'm hoping you can at least see something. It really is a beautiful stitch. I'm going to hand baste my pocket pouches. Last time you wanted to see it, so here you go. The most boring sewing task, but I think it's vital and widely underrated in the sewing world. Basting doesn't distort your fabric and holds the pieces together exceptionally well. The pocket pouches must extend beyond the opening, in my case 2 centimeters, so I double check that measurement. I use some toys even when I hand baste. A needle threader, my super precious magnetic needle holder from Japan, and a leatherwork thimble because it's adjustable. And I have very small fingers. I also use pattern weights to hold the pieces together, at least when I start. And yes, I always hand baste sitting on the floor. Other than this, I'm doing everything like any other person. The basting stitches should go about 3 millimeters from the pocket pouch edge. This is not my best basting, but it never is on camera. The basting is going to help us with cover stitching. It will basically show us our stitching line. It's better to do it using contrasting thread, but I'm using leftover thread because I don't like waste. The only thing to pay attention to in this step is that the pocket pouches should be symmetrical, so always double check, measure twice to save yourself unpicking and swearing. Remember that the pocket pouches should be sewn with the right side facing the wrong side of the bodice, because they're going to be peeking out from our openings. So it's better to see the pretty side. My pocket pouches are 100% cotton jersey. And finally, it's done. We can now top stitch the pocket pouches using a cover stitch. Yet again, I'm using a top and bottom cover, but you might not see much of it as I'm using grey thread. We are cover stitching a curve, so we need to be careful and go slowly. I'm using my basting stitches as a guide. So my basting stitches should always align with one of the needles. Preferably we would be covering the edge of the pocket, but don't worry too much if you have a bit of excess fabric at the back. You can always trim it later, and the perfect placement comes with practice. Usually quite a lot of practice. The stitches are definitely strong enough to hold the pocket pouches in place. In my case it's 5 interlocking threads, but even done on my domestic cover stitch with 4 threads, the pockets were always strong and lasted for years. I have never had a problem with my pockets. I'm cover stitching the other pocket pouch, Again, trying to be careful and precise because I'm cover stitching a curve. The basting stitches are my guide, so I don't have to worry that I'm going off the right position. I'm not pulling the fabric, just helping the machine to do its job. Done. The stitches look beautiful and very professional. The pockets are done. We can now finish sewing our hoodie. It's a raglan sleeve hoodie. I have already sewn the front of the sleeves to the bodice. I'm going to sew the back of the sleeves to the back of the hoodie. The sleeves are sewn flat, and then the side seam is sewn continuously, closing the pockets in the side seam. I have also already sewn my hood together, but I hadn't pressed record, so there is not going to be a footage of me sewing the two sides of the hood together in this video. What you see me doing now is sewing the back of the raglan sleeves to the bodice back. It's a straight seam and nothing exciting can be said about it. Remember that the seam allowances need to match so that neither piece of the fabric grows as we sew. I've once heard someone to refer to it as the seam allowances are kissing, and I quite like it. We can now sew the side seams. I start from the sleeve because the bodice in this pattern is narrower at the bottom. So it doesn't matter where I start. The grain line changes in the same way in both cases. Be careful when you go to the intersecting seams. Here it's our underarm seam. The pieces should match perfectly in the seam allowance. You can stop and check or adjust if the seams are definitely matching. Another important point is that the pocket opening is not enclosed in the seam by accident. It should remain open or there is no point in having a pocket. Always check that nothing is twisted and all the pieces are flat. One side seam is finished, the pocket is now fully functional. We can sew the other side seam. It's going to be one continuous seam again. We need to remember to keep the underarm seam nice and neat, so matching in the seam allowances. Also, we need to make sure the pocket is not closed. We are leaving the opening, which should really not be a problem, as our pocket opening is not in the seam allowances. But in sewing, accidents happen, so double check nothing is folded under the pieces of fabric that are actually meant to be sewn together. You can see that I constantly check if everything is nice and flat and everything matches. Then our bodice is now complete with a pair of easy pockets. I'm going to hem the hood now using the Coverstitch and the hemming guide. That's the hood that I didn't record sewing, but it's only one seam. I'm screwing my hemming guide on with 2 screws. I'm going to measure the distance for my hem and then secure the slider with the little white screw on the guide. My hem is 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch, and hopefully you'll see that the cover on the back is perfect because it's an unlined hood. Well, I hope the hem is going to be perfect. I'm hemming with the right side up because it's easy on a cylinder bed. I'm going to slow down going over the overlocked intersecting seam because someone wanted to see how the machine copes with it. Just to remind you, it's a very heavyweight alpine fleece, so 100% polyester with a mesh back. So I really think the machine is coping exceptionally well, but you can judge for yourself. I'm using size 90-14 needles and spun polyester thread. I fold my hem as I go. This is a well-behaved fabric. I didn't even need to press the hem. It's really easy with the hammer, almost no effort, and I really like the results. And the finished hem of our hood looks like this, and I think it's perfect. I do think it looks very, very professional, and I'm going to show you the back because I think it's perfectly covered. Well, I'm not going to show you because I think it's perfectly covered. I want you to see that it is perfectly covered. There is no excess, and I think the seam is covered perfectly as well. Nothing is gaping, nothing is twisted. I think we can now construct the rest of our hoodie. I'm going to sew the hood to the bodice. The hood is inside the bodice. I have my garment with the wrong side up. I'm making sure that the fronts of the hood are precisely in the middle, and because it's fleece, so it has some stretch, I'm overlapping the hood fronts a few millimeters at first. It's temporary, the hood won't overlap, but it prevents any, even the smallest gap. I start a few centimeters before the center fronts, and as I go over the hood fronts, I have a lot of control. I don't have to pull the right side of the hood to close the gap. There is simply no gap created by the fabric being moved, as my couple of millimeters of the overlap accommodated for that. It's like the turn of the cloth in colours. A very useful little trick. Our hood is nearly done our hoodie is nearly done because all we have to do is add the cuffing and the hemband. And that's the hood attached to the body of the hoodie. And it looks perfect. I'm using a single fold ribbing, so it hasn't got the crease in the middle, and the top is finished, but the bottom is not. And we're going to attach the bottom to our hems, to the sleeves and to the bottom hem. I'm matching the stripes in the seam allowance, so for me it's 8 millimeters, which means the stripes must match within the 8 millimeters. If you're worried your stripes won't match, do it on your regular sewing machine, or at least baste it. But the rule is always the same, the stripes must match perfectly in the seam allowance. That was my bottom band. Now I'm going to do the same with the cuffs. I'm sewing the short edges of the ribbing to form a loop. As always, it's right sides together. I'm leaving a longer tail of the overlocking thread, which I'm going to bury in the seam using a thick needle. At the end, I'm also going to add a couple of straight stitches through the seam allowances to make the seams sit flat inside the cuffs. I'm going to use my lock stitch machine for that, but you can do it by hand. Both cuffs are done, the pattern matching looks decent, so we can now sew all our ribbing to the hoodie. You can sew it on your regular sewing machine, but this particular ribbing would have to have the seams finished, either overlocked or overcast or zigzagged on your machine. The ends in this particular one unravel quite easily. I'm placing my cuffs inside the sleeves, my hoodie is wrong side up. I'm matching the seams, starting a few centimeters before the seam and sewing in the round, making sure all the raw edges are together and there is no gaps. I'm pulling on the ribbing slightly to ease it in. If you are worried that you can't ease it in like that, divide your cuffs and your sleeve bottom in half and match the halves of both the sleeve end and your cuff. But when you look at the technique I'm using, it's actually very easy. I'm matching my quarters as I go. So I'm basically sewing a flat quarter of my cuff to the flat quarter of my sleeve bottom. So there is absolutely no chance of any puckering. And I check if it's all properly sewn together, the seams are matching and the cuff is sitting nicely. And we can do the other one. Again, match the seams in the seam allowance, start before your seam, control the cuff and the fabric as you go. Let the machine do its job and just relax. Just don't relax too much and make sure that the raw edges that you are sewing are together and that nothing has moved. The cuffs are finished, the seams are matching, all raw edges are covered and there is no issues. So we can finally go and sew the bottom band. The bottom band is longer, so you might want to divide it in half or in quarters and match the halves and the quarters of your band and your hem. I'm dividing mine in halves, marking the half with a clip, placing the band inside the hoodie and sewing like the cuffs, gently stretching the ribbing to ease the hoodie in. Again, I'm starting before my seam, making sure the side seam and the joining seam of my band are matching in the seam allowances. And as I sew, I divide my ribbing and the garment into smaller sections, which are sewn flat. As you sew, remember to keep checking if your raw edges are together and nothing is twisting or gaping. If you want to, you can top stitch your band later. You can use your cover stitch for that. Also, as you sew, make sure that your garment is not pulling and distorting the stitches. It should lay flat on the table. We're nearly there. That's the last step, unless of course you want to top stitch the band. And of course it will need to be pressed properly before it's worn, or as it will be in my case, given to somebody else as a present. I keep dividing my band and the hoodie into sections as I sew. It's the best way to be sure that things are matched and the amount of fabric that is eased in is the same everywhere. There will be no puckering, there will be no gaping, no funny ruffles anywhere. But you do need to control your fabric all the time as you sew. And it's nearly done. It's a few little centimeters and everything is finished. That's the last stitch. A bit of quality control, the seams are matching, everything looks fine. Let's turn it to the right side and let's inspect our pockets. They should be functional, and I think they are. They're big pockets. You can put a lot of things in them. Don't forget to like the video and let me know what you think. If you make your own, you can tag me on Instagram and show me what you've made. The finished article, the hoodie is unlined and hemmed with a top and bottom cover. The cuffing is matched well and sits properly in its intended place. The pockets are big and very useful. You can make your own and it shouldn't take you more than a couple of hours. And you can add the pockets to anything you want, any top that is your favorite. I'll make another video with a variation of this pocket, and I'm going to use a contrasting thread so you can see things better. But I hope this has been useful and you can create your own very unique, easy and professional looking pockets in anything you want. And I'm going to show you how the pockets look inside. They are a bit like elephants' ears. I like elephants.